My name is Margaret and I'm 67 years old. The last words I heard before the cold Pacific swallowed me whole were spoken in my daughter-in-law's sweetest voice. Enjoy the ocean, old woman. The sound of those words still echoes in my ears, even now. Not angry words, not shouted, whispered like a lullaby, soft as silk against my cheek as Rebecca leaned close. That's what made my blood freeze long before the water did. The tenderness in her tone, as if she were tucking me into bed instead of sending me to my death. I had been standing at the yacht's railing, watching the sunset paint the water gold, when I heard her footsteps behind me. Light, careful steps across the deck. The boat rocked gently beneath us, and I could hear the soft slap of waves against the hull, the distant cry of seagulls heading home. Such peaceful sounds. Even now, I remember thinking how perfect the evening was, how grateful I felt to share this moment with my family. "Mum's getting a bit tired," Rebecca had said to my son David, her voice carrying on the ocean breeze. "Maybe we should head back soon." I turned to tell her I felt fine, that I was enjoying the salt air and the way the setting sun made everything shimmer. But when I looked at her face, something cold settled in my stomach. Her smile was wrong. Too bright, too fixed, like a mask that didn't quite fit. David stood behind her, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the horizon. My boy. My only child. The one I'd raised alone after his father died. The one I'd built my entire empire for. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Rebecca's right, Mum," he said, and his voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "You look tired." The engine's steady hum seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could hear the soft whistle of wind through the rigging. Everything sounded too sharp, too clear, as if the world had suddenly come into perfect, terrible focus. "I'm not tired," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it didn't matter what I said. The decision had already been made. Rebecca moved closer, her designer heels clicking against the deck with each step. Click, 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 like a countdown. She was wearing the diamond necklace I'd given her for her birthday last month, the one that cost more than most people's houses. It caught the dying light and threw it back in sharp, glittering fragments. "You've worked so hard your whole life, Margaret," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. Her fingers felt cold even through my sweater. "All those long hours building your business, all those sacrifices. Don't you think it's time to rest?" There was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. A hunger, a calculation that made my skin crawl. This wasn't the sweet young woman who'd married my son 3 years ago, who'd called me Mom from their very first dinner together. This was someone else entirely. Someone wearing Rebecca's face. "David," I said, turning to my son, searching his features for any sign of the boy I'd raised. "What's she talking about?" He finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes broke something inside my chest. Not love, not even guilt, just cold, empty resignation. As if I were already dead and he was simply waiting for the formality to be over. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. "It's just business." The yacht lurched slightly as a larger wave passed beneath us, and I grabbed the railing to steady myself. The metal felt warm under my palms, heated by the day's sun. I could smell the salt in the air, could taste it on my lips. Everything felt so vivid, so immediate, as if my body understood what my mind was still refusing to accept. "Business?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. "David, what business? What are you talking about?" Rebecca stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the expensive French one I'd bought her for Christmas, close enough that I could see the tiny lines of satisfaction around her eyes. "Your business, Margaret," she said softly. "All $5 billion of it." That's when I understood. The trust documents I'd signed last month, the ones David had brought to me with tears in his eyes, talking about estate planning and protecting the family legacy. The papers I'd reviewed with my lawyer, or the man I'd thought was my lawyer, the signatures I'd put on line after line, trusting my son completely. "You didn't," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew they had. David's jaw tightened. "The money should have been mine years ago, Mum. You're 67 years old. How much longer were you planning to hold on to everything?" The boat rocked again, and this time I heard something else beneath the sound of the waves, the deliberate shifting of weight, the careful positioning of feet. They were moving, circling me like predators who'd finally cornered their prey. "I built that company from nothing," I said, my voice growing stronger, even as my situation grew more desperate. "Every dollar, every contract, every success, I earned it. And now it's time to pass it on," Rebecca said, her hand moving to my back, pressing just slightly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked out at the water, at the vast expanse of ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. We were miles from shore, far enough that no one would hear me scream, far enough that my body might never be found. Just an old woman who tragically fell overboard during a family outing, a terrible accident that would make my grieving son and daughter-in-law very, very wealthy. "The papers," I said, stalling for time, my mind racing. "The transfers aren't complete yet. The lawyer said "Oh, but they are," Rebecca interrupted, her voice bright with false cheer. "We took care of everything this morning while you were at your doctor's appointment. Amazing what a power of attorney can accomplish." The sound of her laughter mixed with the cry of seagulls overhead, and I felt something inside me shift and harden. Not fear anymore, but something sharper, something that tasted of steel and salt water. "You forged my signature," I said. "We used your signature," David corrected. "From the documents you signed last month. Very carefully, very legally. By tomorrow morning, you'll officially be suffering from advanced dementia, completely incompetent to manage your affairs. Such a tragedy, really. But don't worry, we'll take good care of your money." The pressure on my back increased, and I felt Rebecca's breath against my ear as she leaned close one final time. "Enjoy the ocean, old woman." The push came swift and sudden, catching me completely off guard. I felt my feet leave the deck, felt the railing slip away from my grasping fingers. For a moment I hung suspended in the air, the yacht's lights growing smaller beneath me, the sound of the engine fading as I fell. The water hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and shocking my system into desperate survival mode. I surfaced gasping, salt water burning my throat, my heavy clothes already dragging me down. Above me, the yacht continued on its course, my son and daughter-in-law standing at the railing watching me struggle. I treaded water as best I could, fighting against the weight of my waterlogged sweater, and called out to them, "David, help me!" But they just stood there, two silhouettes against the dying light, waiting for me to disappear beneath the waves. That's when I heard it. Another sound cutting through the splash of water and my own laboured breathing. The low, steady thrum of a second engine growing closer. The boat that pulled alongside me wasn't some random Good Samaritan. As strong hands hauled me from the water, I looked up into the weathered face of Captain Torres, the harbour master I'd been paying for 15 years to keep my personal dock secure. But tonight, he wasn't here by coincidence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, wrapping a rough wool blanket around my shaking shoulders. "Right on schedule." My teeth were chattering so hard I could barely speak, but I managed to get the words out. Did you get it all?" He nodded toward a sophisticated camera mounted on his boat's cabin, its lens pointing in the direction my son's yacht had disappeared. "Every second, ma'am. High definition, night vision capable. The audio's crystal clear too. That little microphone you've been wearing worked perfectly." I touched my chest, feeling for the tiny recording device I'd pinned inside my bra that morning. Still there, still warm against my skin. For 6 months I'd worn it everywhere David and Rebecca might be, waiting for them to reveal their true intentions. Tonight, they'd finally given me everything I needed. "The whole confession?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Torres had been recording our family dinner conversations for weeks, ever since I'd first noticed the way Rebecca looked at my financial statements when she thought I wasn't watching. Everything, he confirmed, starting the engine. The forged documents, the fake power of attorney, the planned murder, all of it, plus video of them pushing you overboard and watching you struggle. Any jury in the world will convict them. As we headed toward shore, I closed my eyes and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. My own son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college tuition I'd paid without question, had just tried to murder me for money. The betrayal cut deeper than the cold Pacific water, deeper than I'd thought anything could. But beneath the pain, something else was growing. Something that felt like winter steel. "Mrs. Whitmore," Torres said gently, "there's something else you should know. While you were out there, I got a call from your real lawyer. Mr. Patterson says everything's ready on his end." James Patterson. My actual attorney, not the imposter David had brought to me last month. The man who'd helped me build ironclad protections around my fortune that my son couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. While David thought he was stealing from a helpless old woman, I'd been 20 steps ahead of him. "The decoy documents they signed," I said, more to myself than to Torres. "They took the bait completely." "Hook, line, and sinker," he agreed. "They have no idea those papers transfer exactly nothing. Your real will is still locked in Mr. Patterson's vault, and your actual power of attorney designates someone they've never even heard of." I smiled for the first time since Rebecca had whispered her poison in my ear. My sister's daughter in Portland, sweet Sarah, who teaches kindergarten and has never met either of them. The irony was delicious. While David and Rebecca congratulated themselves on their brilliant scheme, they'd actually signed documents that gave them legal claim to nothing more than my collection of antique teacups. The real fortune, every stock, every property, every investment account, remained completely beyond their reach. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. "Torres," I said, my voice gaining strength as we approached the harbour lights, "I want you to call Detective Morrison. Tell him to meet us at the house." Detective Morrison had been investigating financial crimes for the LAPD for 20 years. More importantly, he owed me a favour. 3 years ago, when his daughter needed an experimental cancer treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, I'd quietly paid for everything. She was healthy now, a senior in high school with a full scholarship to Stanford. He'd told me once that if I ever needed anything at all, I only had to ask. Tonight, I was asking. "You want them arrested tonight?" Torres asked, manoeuvring his boat toward my private dock. "I want them arrested the moment they step foot in my house," I corrected. "Let them enjoy their victory dinner first. Let them toast to my death and plan how they'll spend my money. Then, when they're feeling most triumphant, most secure in their success, that's when we destroy them." The boat bumped gently against the dock, and Torres helped me onto the wooden planks. My legs were still unsteady, my clothes were soaked through, and I probably looked like exactly what I was supposed to be, a drowned old woman. Perfect. "There's a car waiting," Torres said, pointing to a black sedan parked near the harbour entrance. "Mr. Patterson's inside." I walked toward the car on shaking legs, the blanket still wrapped around my shoulders, seawater dripping from my hair. With each step, I felt myself transforming from victim back into the woman who'd built a $5 billion empire from nothing. The woman who'd survived her husband's death, hostile takeovers, economic recessions, and 1,000 smaller betrayals. The woman who was about to remind her son and daughter-in-law that Margaret Whitmore didn't go down without a fight. James Patterson stepped out of the sedan as I approached, his silver hair gleaming under the harbour lights. He was dressed in an expensive suit despite the late hour, and his expression was grim but determined. "Margaret," he said, embracing me carefully, "I'm so sorry you had to go through with this." "It was the only way to get them to show their true colours," I replied, accepting the dry clothes he handed me from the car. "Did everything go according to plan on your end?" "Better than we hoped," he said, opening a leather briefcase. "While you were playing dead, I was very much alive in Judge Hartwell's chambers." I presented him with the evidence of the forgery, the fraudulent power of attorney and the attempted murder. He's already signed the warrants. I smiled grimly. Judge Hartwell was another old friend, someone who understood the value of justice over sentiment. When I'd called him 2 weeks ago to explain what I suspected David and Rebecca were planning, he'd been appalled but not surprised. Apparently, he'd seen plenty of cases where family greed overcame family love. The charges? I asked, though I already knew they would be severe. Attempted murder in the first degree, fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and elder abuse, Patterson recited. Between the recording, the video evidence, and the forged documents, we have enough to put them away for 30 years minimum. As I changed into dry clothes behind the car, using the open doors as a privacy screen, I caught sight of my reflection in the side mirror. My makeup was ruined, my carefully styled hair hung in wet tangles, and my skin looked pale and drawn. I looked every one of my 67 years and more. But my eyes burned with something that had nothing to do with salt water. "How long do we have?" I asked, adjusting the collar of the fresh blouse Patterson had brought. "Torres called ahead. Your son's yacht docked about 20 minutes ago. Our surveillance team reports they're currently at Chez Laurent, celebrating with champagne and lobster." Of course they were. The restaurant where David had proposed to Rebecca, where they'd celebrated every anniversary since. They were probably toasting their brilliant plan right now, marvelling at how easy it had been to kill the old woman who'd given them everything. "They'll head home within the hour," Patterson continued. "Detective Morrison and his team are already in position around your house." I nodded, climbing into the passenger seat of the sedan. "And the media?" "Ready to go live the moment the arrests are made. Channel 7 has been sitting on the story for weeks, waiting for tonight. By morning, everyone in the city will know exactly what David and Rebecca tried to do." The thought of my son's face on the evening news, being perp-walked in handcuffs, should have brought me pain. Instead, I felt only a cold satisfaction. He'd made his choice when he stood by and watched Rebecca push me into the ocean. Now he would live with the consequences. We drove through the quiet streets of Malibu, past the houses of neighbours who'd known me for decades, who'd watched David grow up, who'd celebrated his wedding and welcomed Rebecca into our family. By tomorrow, they'd all know the truth. The betrayal wouldn't be mine alone to bear anymore. "Margaret," Patterson said quietly, as we turned into my driveway, "are you absolutely certain about this? Once we go through with the arrests, there's no going back. David is still your son." I looked up at my house, the house where I'd raised David as a single mother, where I'd taught him his values, where I'd believed I was building something meaningful to pass down to future generations. Every window was dark, waiting for the family to return home. "James," I said, my voice steady and clear, "my son died the moment he decided to kill me for money. What's coming home tonight is just a stranger wearing his face." We parked at the far end of the circular driveway, behind a row of police vehicles hidden from the street view. Detective Morrison approached the car as we got out, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes filled with barely controlled anger. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I've reviewed the evidence. What they did to you tonight." He shook his head. "I've been doing this job for 20 years and I've never seen anything quite this cold-blooded." "They'll be here soon," I said, checking my watch. "Are your people ready?" "We have the house surrounded," he confirmed. "The moment they walk through that front door, we'll have them. But Margaret, they're going to know something's wrong the instant they see you. Are you prepared for that confrontation?" I thought about Rebecca's whispered words, about the feel of her hands pushing me toward death, about my son's empty eyes as he watched me fall. Then I thought about the empire I'd built, the employees who depended on me, the charities I supported, the legacy I'd worked my entire life to create. "Detective," I said, straightening my shoulders, "I've been preparing for this confrontation my whole life. I just didn't know it until tonight." We took our positions inside the house, me in my usual chair in the living room, Patterson and Morrison hidden in the kitchen, where they could hear everything, the other officers stationed throughout the house and grounds. I sat in the dim lamplight, my hair still damp from the ocean, my clothes dry but my spirit burning with righteous fury. Through the window I could see headlights turning into the driveway. They were home. The sound of David's key in the front door echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, the one I'd occupied every evening for the past 15 years, positioned so I could see the entryway while remaining partially hidden in shadow. My hands were folded calmly in my lap, but beneath the surface my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. I heard Rebecca's laughter first, bright, musical, completely carefree. The sound of a woman who believed she'd just become $5 billion richer. "I still can't believe how easy it was," she was saying as they stepped through the doorway. "Did you see her face when she realized what was happening? That moment of pure terror right before she—" Her words cut off abruptly as the living room came into view. Through the archway she could see me sitting in my chair, very much alive, very much dry, wearing a fresh set of clothes and watching them with the calm patience of a predator. The champagne bottle she'd been carrying slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor, sending glass and Dom Perignon everywhere. The crash was deafening in the sudden silence. "Hello, Rebecca," I said, my voice perfectly level. "David, how was dinner?" David stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through expressions like a broken kaleidoscope. Shock, confusion, fear, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of my real son in his eyes, the boy who'd once cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly. "Mum," he whispered, and there was something raw and broken in his voice. "How are you?" "Alive?" I finished for him. "Yes, I noticed that too. Quite inconvenient for your plans, I imagine." Rebecca recovered first, as I'd known she would. Her shock melted away, replaced by that calculating mask I'd seen glimpses of before but never fully recognized. She stepped forward, her designer heels crunching through the broken glass, and I could see her mind racing, trying to find an angle, a story, some way to explain what had just happened. "Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Thank God you're all right. We were so worried when you fell overboard. David dove in after you immediately, but the current was so strong. We thought we'd lost you." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. Even now, caught red-handed, she was trying to rewrite history, to cast herself and David as the heroes of a tragic accident, rather than the villains of an attempted murder. "Is that your story?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "That David tried to save me?" "Of course that's the story," Rebecca snapped, some of her composure cracking. "It's the truth. You're obviously confused, probably suffering from hypothermia or shock. David, call Dr. Morrison. Your mother needs medical attention." But David hadn't moved. He stood there staring at me like I was a ghost, which in a way, I supposed I was. The ghost of the mother he'd tried to kill, returned to haunt him. "She knows," he said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of absolute defeat. "Look at her, Rebecca. She knows exactly what we did." Rebecca whirled on him, her eyes flashing with fury. "Shut up, David. Don't say another word." "Too late for that, I'm afraid," I said, reaching into the side table drawer and pulling out a small digital recorder. I set it on the coffee table between us, its red recording light blinking steadily. "I've been recording this entire conversation, just like I recorded our little chat on the yacht earlier tonight." The blood drained from Rebecca's face so quickly I thought she might faint. She sank onto the couch across from me, her perfect composure finally, completely shattered. "You were wearing a wire," she breathed. "For 6 months," I confirmed. "Every family dinner, every casual conversation, every time you thought you were being clever. I heard it all. Your plans, your timeline, your complete lack of regard for anything but my money." David finally moved, stumbling forward and collapsing into the chair beside Rebecca. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "How did you know?" A mother knows her child, I said simply. You changed, David. Little things at first, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching, the questions you started asking about my will, the sudden interest in my health and mental capacity. But it was Rebecca who gave you away completely. I stood up, moving to the mantelpiece where family photos had sat for years. Pictures of David as a child, his graduation, his wedding day. Pictures of happier times when I'd believed in the family we were building together. 3 months ago, Rebecca, you made a mistake, I continued, picking up David's college graduation photo. You called me Margaret instead of Mum during an argument about the trust fund. Just once, just for a moment, but that slip told me everything I needed to know. You'd stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as an obstacle. Rebecca's hands were clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. You don't understand, she said, her voice tight with desperation. We weren't going to hurt you. The plan was just to push me off a yacht in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and watch me drown, I interrupted. What part of that wasn't meant to hurt me? You're 67 years old, Rebecca exploded, jumping to her feet. How much longer were you planning to live? Another 10 years? 20? You have more money than you could spend in 5 lifetimes, and you're hoarding it all like some kind of dragon. So you decided to help me along to the grave? We decided to claim what should have been ours anyway, she screamed, all pretense abandoned now. David is your only heir. That money was always going to be his eventually, we just moved up the timeline. The raw honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. Not the greed, I'd expected that, but the complete absence of love, of family feeling, of any recognition that I was a human being rather than just an obstacle to their wealth. David, I said softly, turning to my son, is that how you see it too? That I was just in the way? He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd raised, the child who'd once told me I was the best mother in the whole world. I'm sorry, he whispered. Mum, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to. Rebecca said it was the only way, that you'd never willingly give up control, that you'd hold on to everything until you died naturally, and by then there might be nothing left. Nothing left? I stared at him in disbelief. David, my company's value has tripled in the last 5 years. There's more wealth now than when your father was alive. But for how long? Rebecca cut in, moving to stand behind David's chair like a general positioning her troops. You're getting older, making questionable decisions. Last year you donated 50 million to charity without consulting anyone. 50 million, Margaret, that was our money you gave away. That was my money, I corrected. Money I earned, money I had every right to donate to causes I believed in. Money that should have gone to family first, she shot back. Money that should have secured David's future, our children's futures. What children? I asked sharply. You've been married 3 years and shown no interest in having children. In fact, I distinctly remember you telling me last Christmas that kids would interfere with your lifestyle. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Another lie exposed, another manipulation revealed. The point is, David said weakly, trying to regain some control of the conversation. We felt like we had no choice. You've always been so controlling, so determined to run everything yourself. I built this empire from nothing, I said, my voice rising for the first time since they'd arrived. While other women my age were playing bridge and planning garden parties, I was working 18-hour days, fighting for every contract, every deal, every dollar. I earned the right to control what I created. And now it's time to pass it on, Rebecca said, her voice turning cold and calculating again, whether you want to or not. I smiled then, a sharp, predatory expression that made both of them take a step back. Oh, but I already have passed it on, I said sweetly. Those documents you signed last month, the ones transferring control of my assets to David, they're completely valid. David's face brightened for just a moment before I continued. Of course, they only transfer control of the assets I designated, which amounts to my collection of antique teacups, my grandmother's recipe books, and approximately $3,000 in a checking account I use for household expenses. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear the distant sound of waves against the shore, could hear Rebecca's sharp intake of breath as the full scope of their failure hit her. The real estate, the stock portfolio, the business interests, the investment accounts, all of that is controlled by a different trust entirely, one you never even knew existed, one that designates my niece Sarah as my successor, with my actual lawyer James Patterson as executor. David stood up slowly, his face pale as parchment. You planned this. All of it. You knew what we were going to do. I suspected, I corrected. I hoped I was wrong. Right up until tonight, I hoped that when the moment came, you'd choose love over money, that you'd stop Rebecca or stop yourself or find some shred of the son I raised. Mom! But you didn't, I continued, my voice growing harder with each word. You stood there and watched her push me into the ocean. You watched me struggle in the water, calling for help, and you did nothing. You let me believe I was going to die alone and betrayed by the two people I loved most in the world. Rebecca sank back onto the couch, her face in her hands. This isn't happening, she muttered. This can't be happening. Oh, but it gets better, I said, moving back to my chair and sitting down with deliberate calm. You see, while you two were celebrating my death over champagne and lobster, I was very busy making some phone calls. I reached for the phone on the side table and held it up so they could see the display. I called the FBI, David, specifically Agent Sarah Chen in the White-Collar Crime Division. It turns out that attempted murder for financial gain falls under federal jurisdiction when the victim's assets exceed a certain threshold. David's legs gave out and he collapsed back into his chair. Federal charges, he whispered. I also called the State Attorney General, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the IRS, I continued conversationally. Amazing how interested they all became when I mentioned that my son and daughter-in-law had attempted to murder me for my fortune using forged documents and fraudulent powers of attorney. Rebecca looked up at me with eyes full of pure hatred. You vindictive old bitch. I prefer survivor, I replied. But while we're being honest with each other, let me share one more little detail you might find interesting. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the driveway where I could see the silhouettes of law enforcement vehicles hidden in the shadows. Remember that nice young lawyer who helped you with the trust documents last month? The one David introduced as my new estate attorney? Well, it turns out he wasn't actually a lawyer at all. He was an undercover FBI agent who's been building a case against financial predators who target elderly family members. The colour drained from David's face completely. No, that's not possible. I found him myself. I vetted him. You found him exactly where I wanted you to find him, I said, turning back to face them. David, darling, did you really think you were the first person to try to steal from me? I've been dealing with predators and fortune hunters my entire career. I know how to set a trap. Rebecca jumped to her feet, her face twisted with rage. You set us up. This whole thing was a setup. This whole thing was a test, I corrected. A test of whether my son truly loved me or just loved my money. A test of whether the family I'd built meant anything beyond dollar signs. I looked directly at David, memorizing his features one last time. You both failed spectacularly. From the kitchen came the sound of footsteps, and James Patterson emerged, followed by Detective Morrison and 3 uniformed officers. David and Rebecca spun around, finally understanding that they were surrounded, that their nightmare was just beginning. David Whitmore and Rebecca Whitmore, Detective Morrison said, pulling out his handcuffs. You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. As the officers moved toward them, Rebecca made one last desperate play. She turned to me with tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped in front of her like a supplicant. Margaret, please, she begged. I know you're angry, but we're family. Surely we can work this out without involving the police. I'll sign anything you want, do anything you ask. Just don't destroy our lives over this. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd called me Mom, who'd shared holiday dinners at my table, who'd sat beside my hospital bed when I'd had pneumonia last winter. This woman who'd whispered sweet words in my ear as she pushed me toward death. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "you destroyed your own life the moment you decided mine was worth less than money. I'm just making sure the world knows what you really are." The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, and she let out a wail of anguish that echoed through the house. David submitted to arrest in stunned silence, his eyes never leaving my face, as if he was trying to memorize the mother he'd lost forever. As they were led toward the door, David stopped and turned back to me one last time. "Mum," he said, his voice breaking, "what happens now?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not my son but a stranger who'd inherited his face. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd hoped he'd become, was gone. In his place stood someone who'd chosen money over love, greed over loyalty, murder over patience. "Now?" I said, my voice steady and final. "Now you learn what it means to face the consequences of your choices. And I learn what it means to live without the illusion of family." They were led away into the night, and I stood in my doorway watching as the police cars disappeared down the driveway, carrying away the last remnants of the life I'd thought I was building. But as I turned back toward my empty house, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. On the coffee table where I'd left the digital recorder, there was nothing but empty space. The device was gone. I stared at the empty space on the coffee table, my mind racing through possibilities. The recorder had been there when I'd stood up to look out the window. It had been there when Patterson and Detective Morrison emerged from the kitchen. But now, as the police cars disappeared into the night, it was gone. My first instinct was panic. Without that recording, the case against David and Rebecca became significantly weaker. They could claim I was confused, that I'd made up the entire story, that a grieving mother was trying to destroy her son out of spite. The video footage from Torres's boat was good, but the audio confession from the yacht, that was the smoking gun. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned to see James Patterson emerging from the living room, and in his hand was my missing recorder. "Looking for this?" he asked, holding up the device with a slight smile. "James, what are you doing? Why did you take it?" He walked over to me, his expression gentle but serious. "Because, my dear friend, we're not quite done yet." Before I could ask what he meant, I heard another sound that made my blood chill, the soft click of a key in the front door. But David and Rebecca were gone, arrested and on their way to county lockup. Who else had access to my house? The door opened, and my sister Catherine stepped inside, followed by her daughter Sarah, my designated heir, the kindergarten teacher from Portland who was supposed to be the innocent beneficiary of my real trust. Except Sarah wasn't dressed like a kindergarten teacher. She wore an expensive business suit, carried herself with the confident stride of someone used to boardrooms, and looked at me with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone who was supposed to be out of the loop. "Hello, Aunt Margaret," Sarah said, her voice carrying none of the warmth I remembered from our family gatherings. "I hope you don't mind the late visit, but we have some business to discuss." Catherine moved to stand beside her daughter, and I saw something in her face I'd never noticed before, a calculating coldness that reminded me uncomfortably of Rebecca. "Catherine," I said slowly, my mind struggling to process this new development. "What's going on? How did you get here so quickly from Portland?" "We never left Los Angeles," Sarah replied, settling onto the couch as if she owned the place. "We've been staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel for the past week, waiting for tonight's festivities to conclude." James Patterson moved to stand between me and the door, and suddenly I realized that the man I'd trusted with my life, my fortune, and my revenge was not the ally I'd believed him to be. "James," I whispered, "what is this?" "This, Margaret, is the real plan," he said, his voice filled with something that might have been regret. The plan that's been in motion for much longer than 6 months. Sarah opened a briefcase I hadn't noticed her carrying and pulled out a thick stack of documents. You see, Aunt Margaret, while you were so focused on David and Rebecca's amateur hour attempts at your fortune, you missed the real threat entirely. She spread the papers across the coffee table, and I could see they were legal documents, transfer papers, death certificates, all bearing official seals and signatures. 3 years ago, when David married Rebecca, we realised they were going to make a play for your money eventually, Catherine said, speaking for the first time since entering. They were obvious about it, clumsy, emotional. We knew they'd fail. But their failure would create an opportunity, Sarah continued. You see, once David was arrested for attempted murder, he'd be legally disqualified from inheriting anything. And your backup will, the one you thought was so clever, designates me as your sole heir. I sank into my armchair, the full scope of the betrayal washing over me like ice water. You used David and Rebecca as what? A distraction? A stalking horse, James confirmed. We let them pursue their clumsy scheme while we put together something much more sophisticated. Tonight, while you were playing dead in the ocean, I was in Judge Hartwell's chambers, not getting arrest warrants but filing papers to have you declared legally incompetent due to advanced dementia. What? Sarah pulled out another document, this one bearing a doctor's signature I recognised. Dr. Henley has been documenting your declining mental state for months. Memory loss, confusion, paranoid delusions about family members trying to harm you. Tonight's elaborate fantasy about recording devices and fake lawyers will be the final proof that you've lost touch with reality. I stared at the medical report, seeing my own doctor's handwriting describing symptoms I'd never experienced, conversations that had never happened, a diagnosis that was completely fabricated. Dr. Henley is Sarah's godfather, Catherine explained. He's been part of our family for 30 years. When we explained the situation, he was more than willing to help protect you from David's influence. This is insane, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You can't just declare someone incompetent because you want their money. Actually, we can, James said, pulling out yet another set of papers, especially when that person has spent the evening creating elaborate scenarios involving non-existent FBI agents, imaginary recording devices, and false accusations against family members. I felt the world tilting beneath me. The FBI agent, the fake lawyer David used, was exactly what David thought he was, a legitimate estate attorney named Michael Rogers, Sarah said. We fed David his name through a mutual acquaintance, let him do his research, let him believe he was being clever. The documents David signed were real transfers, Margaret. He actually does own your teacup collection now. But the rest of your assets, Catherine continued, will go to Sarah as your legal guardian once the competency hearing is complete, which should be sometime next week, after you've had a few days to settle into Sunset Manor. Sunset Manor, I repeated. A lovely assisted living facility in Riverside, James explained. Very quiet, very private. The kind of place where a confused elderly woman can live out her remaining years in peace with her loving niece managing her affairs. I looked around my living room, my sanctuary, my home, the place where I'd built my life and my empire. In the span of a few hours, I'd lost my son, my daughter-in-law, and now my sister and niece. Everyone I'd trusted, everyone I'd loved, had been planning to destroy me. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of absolute betrayal, something else began to build inside me. Not despair this time, but something harder. Something that had kept me alive through decades of corporate warfare and personal tragedy. There's just one problem with your plan, I said quietly. Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Really? And what's that? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small device I'd been carrying all evening. Not the recorder they'd seen me use, but a second one, smaller and more sophisticated. The device James took was a decoy, I said, holding up the real recorder. This one has been transmitting everything directly to the FBI field office for the past 6 hours. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ocean waves in the distance. Moreover, I continued, standing up with more strength than I'd felt all evening, Agent Sarah Chen of the White Collar Crime Division is real, and she's been investigating financial elder abuse cases for 3 years. When I called her 6 months ago to report my suspicions about David and Rebecca, she suggested we expand the investigation to see who else might surface. James took a step toward me, but I held up my hand. Dr. Henley's medical records are falsified. James's competency filing is fraudulent, and Sarah's power of attorney documents are forged, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. All federal crimes, all captured on recording, all punishable by significant prison time. Catherine's face had gone white as parchment. You're bluffing. Am I? I moved to the window and looked out at the driveway. Because unless I'm very much mistaken, Agent Chen should be arriving right about... The sound of car doors slamming interrupted me, followed by the distinctive rhythm of multiple sets of footsteps approaching the house. Through the window, I could see FBI agents in tactical vests surrounding the property. Now. The front door burst open, and Agent Chen entered with 4 other federal agents, their weapons drawn but pointed safely downward. Margaret Whitmore? Agent Chen asked, though she clearly already knew who I was. That's me, I replied. And these are the people I told you about, the ones who've been planning to have me declared incompetent so they could steal my fortune. As the agents moved to arrest Catherine, Sarah, and James, I felt a strange sense of completion. For months I'd been playing a dangerous game, setting traps within traps, using my family's greed against them while building an unshakable case with federal law enforcement. Aunt Margaret, Sarah said as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. How did you know? I looked at her. This young woman I'd watched grow up, whose college education I'd helped pay for, who'd once sent me handmade Christmas cards from her kindergarten class. Because, my dear, I said sadly, I've been in business for 40 years. I know the difference between family loyalty and family greed, and I learned a long time ago that the people closest to you are often the most dangerous. As they were led away, Catherine turned back to me with tears in her eyes. Margaret, we're sisters. How could you do this to your own family? I considered her question for a moment, thinking about loyalty and betrayal, about love and money, about the family I'd thought I was building, and the strangers who'd been wearing their faces. Catherine, I said finally, you stopped being my family the moment you decided I was worth more dead than alive. I'm just making sure you face the consequences of that choice. After everyone was gone and the house was quiet again, Agent Chen stayed behind to debrief me. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, settling into the chair David had occupied earlier, I have to ask, how long have you suspected your sister and niece? I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle I kept for special occasions and considered her question. Catherine's been asking pointed questions about my will for years, I said. But it was James who gave them away. 3 months ago, he suggested I update my estate planning to include more family members. When I pressed him about why, he mentioned how Sarah was struggling financially as a teacher, how she could use some security. But Sarah wasn't struggling. Exactly. I'd been sending her money regularly, helping with her mortgage, her car payments, her student loans. There was no financial struggle, which meant James was either completely uninformed about my family's situation or he was lying. Agent Chen nodded. So you started the investigation. I started setting traps, I corrected. I let David and Rebecca think they were being clever while I built a case against the real threats. I knew that if I could get David arrested, it would flush out whoever was waiting in the wings. And the recording devices? I smiled, feeling genuinely amused for the first time all evening. I've been wearing 3 different recording devices for 6 months. One hidden in my clothing, one in my jewellery, and one surgically implanted under my skin. Belt and suspenders, Agent Chen. Belt and suspenders. After Agent Chen left, I walked through my empty house, turning off lights and checking locks. Tomorrow the media would have a field day with the story of the wealthy widow whose entire family had tried to murder her for money. There would be interviews, legal proceedings, probably a book deal and a movie. But tonight, I was simply a 77-year-old woman who'd learned that she was completely alone in the world. Except, was I really alone? I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized years ago but never called. "Maria," I said when the familiar voice answered. "It's Margaret Whitmore. I know it's late, but would you like to have lunch tomorrow? I find myself in need of genuine friendship." Maria Santos had been my housekeeper for 15 years before I'd helped her start her own cleaning business. She'd never asked me for anything beyond fair wages and respect, never shown anything but genuine affection for the lonely widow who'd trusted her with the run of a multi-million-dollar home. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, and I could hear the warmth in her voice. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine now," I said, looking around my house, my home, with new eyes. "I'll tell you all about it tomorrow." As I hung up the phone, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty, trust, and genuine care. It's about the people who stand by you when there's nothing in it for them, who celebrate your successes without calculating what they mean for their own bank accounts. I'd spent so much time focused on the family I'd been born into, and the family I'd created through marriage, that I'd missed the real family I'd been building all along. The employees who'd helped me build my empire, the friends who'd stood by me through good times and bad, the community of people who valued me for who I was rather than what I owned. Tomorrow I would start building that family more intentionally. I would create a foundation, establish scholarships, support the people and causes that had supported me. I would turn my fortune into a tool for building genuine relationships rather than attracting false ones. But tonight, I sat in my armchair with my wine and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd survived. I'd been betrayed by everyone I'd trusted most, pushed to the edge of death by the people who should have protected me, and I'd not only survived but triumphed. I raised my glass in a toast to my empty living room. "To Margaret Whitmore," I said aloud, "survivor, businesswoman, and as of tonight officially nobody's fool." Outside, the ocean waves continued their eternal rhythm, washing away the traces of one life and preparing the shore for whatever came next. I took a sip of wine and began planning my new beginning. After all, at 77 years old, I was just getting started.